connecting with a bunch of audience people, so it'll take a few more seconds. And we're live. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to NSMA 2021 Live. We're super pleased to have Bryan Tramont, partner at Wilkinson, Barker, Knauer, and Danielle Thumann, legal advisor to FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, for the State of the Spectrum discussion. And just a little more background. Bryan serves as a managing partner of Wilkinson, Barker, Knauer, and in that role, Bryan offers strategic counsel to the Fortune 100 companies, trade associations, and also small and mid-sized businesses, and media companies of all aspects of communications law. He also designs and executes the entire Barker growth plan. And I've known Bryan for, I guess, decades now. He was chief of staff at the FCC back in the day. Very bright, fun, always a thought leader, and we're always super happy to hear from him. And Danielle was also at the Wilkinson Barker firm. She's now a legal advisor to Commissioner Brendan Carr. Besides being a communications attorney at Wilkinson Barker, she focused on a wide variety of regulatory policy and transactional issues, with a special focus on infrastructure, public safety, and spectrum policy, which are all at the heart of what we do here. So we're super pleased to have Danielle and Bryan here to talk. And take it away, guys. We'll field questions at the back end, so pleased to have you here.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be back. Danielle and I were ready to go yesterday. We were all prepared with our Ryan Seacrest and Kelly Ripa Good Morning Spectrum policymakers approach, and we apologize. We had some technical difficulties that sort of slowed us down. So it's great to be here. I have been coming to this conference for, I think, 15 years or so. It's great to do it virtually, and I'm thrilled that Danielle could join us this morning and be my partner in crime. I'm looking up at her on the big screen here in the conference room. So welcome aboard, Danielle. How's it going as a legal advisor?
It's going really well so far. It's been about 2 months. I feel like the first month is all about figuring it out, and now I'm really, I've hit the ground running. I am really enjoying it. The biggest transition was probably not having to bill my time anymore, which is just a weird feeling, not thinking of everything in 6-minute increments. But it's going really well.
Great. And tell us just when will you guys get back into the building? The FCC has moved, for those of you in Spectrum land. So we're all going to be going to a new mecca of Spectrum policy, so to speak. When will folks get back in the building? Do we know yet?
No official date yet. They hope to start bringing people back in September. Some of us can go in if we really, have a need to before then, but it's nothing yet. I haven't been in yet. I haven't seen it yet. I don't think I have an official office yet, so things are still up in the air a little bit.
Details. Well, at any rate, why don't I thought, Danielle, we'd kick it off this spring. I'll talk a little bit about the political landscape of the commission, and then maybe we can dive in a little bit to what Commissioner Carr is thinking about, what you've been working on in your early tenure at the FCC.
Sounds great.
All right. So to just review the bidding a little bit on where we are politically on spectrum management, I know you heard from Ira and other thought leaders yesterday, but we do have a 2-2 commission. So at the end of the Pai administration, at the end of the Trump administration, Chairman Pai did leave the FCC, leaving us with a 2-2 split. Commissioner Symington, as you may recall, was confirmed last year. So he's the second Republican. So Nathan Symington, our newest commissioner. And then Commissioner Carr, the senior Republican for whom Danielle works. Jeffrey Starks, Democrat, has been the commission about 3 years. And then finally, acting chairwoman Rosenworcel. So we're at a 2-2 split, waiting for the chairman to be designated by the president, and also for a third Democratic commissioner to be nominated and confirmed. So as you may recall, the president just picks a chair. That's not a separately Senate confirmed position, so the president can designate, and President Biden designated Commissioner Rosenworcel as the acting chair. She's not yet the permanent chair, and we don't know if the new third Democratic commissioner will be named chair or what the exact lineup will be, so we're waiting for that to roll. We're getting about to the regular time an appointment occurs. I know everyone's impatient, probably especially Commissioner Rosenworcel, for the president to name a final chairman. but it does tend to take a while, especially in a new administration, for these names to pop up. We also, at this moment, don't have a name for NTIA. There were some press reports circulating this week about possible frontrunners, and we'll just have to stay tuned to see how that works out. But at the moment, those vacancies at the top do create a certain amount of slow down a little bit some of the momentum on some of the issues that might be tackled by the new administration until we have leadership in place in those spots on the spectrum issue in particular. That being said, the 2-2 commission has been really productive early on, lots of 4-0 votes, lots of bipartisan cooperation that I think has accrued to everyone's benefit. And they have not hit any major bumps in the road on that front. And it comes off of a very successful run of the Pai administration on spectrum management. Whether you look at the C-band, $80 billion success story, 2.5, 3.45 to 3.55, which has an auction coming up, 6 gigahertz, even 5.9. There's a lot of controversial calls that were made that I can talk about a little bit after Danielle goes through what's ahead on the spectrum side. But I do think it's worth taking a pause just to note how much was accomplished in the last 4 years. Especially, I would point to the C-band as maybe being crown jewel of that accomplishment. It's just such a complicated regulatory proceeding with incumbents offering a voluntary move, and then originally going to be able to keep the value gained by selling their spectrum, the flexible rights, then modifying those rules, and still pulling it off and getting 280 megahertz, and then getting through the most successful auction in commission history. There's still more to go there, including getting the spectrum incumbents to successfully transition, the satellite guys, to successfully transition into a smaller slice of spectrum. That's going to be a big undertaking. Lots of folks, especially auction winners, are very invested in that, but it's still something that the commission has to keep an eye on. And there's still some legacy issues around, some additional interference issues, but by and large, a huge success for the Pai Commission. And then to also have the 3.45 already in the queue for auction this year is also a nice success story. So I'm going to let Danielle talk a little bit about some other things that are coming ahead, and then I'll touch on a couple other major spectrum proceedings that still have some things maybe outstanding that we're going to watch, and we'll go from there. Danielle, anything you want to comment on political landscape? Did I mess anything up?
No, I think you got the political landscape right. As you said, there are a lot of bipartisan things coming out of the commission. We've been really busy. Every month we've had a very full agenda. And all of the offices are working together really, really well right now on a lot of good policy. So I know you said some offices are in a rush. I don't know that our office is in a rush. But
I can't imagine why not.
Yeah, but things are going really well. I thought I would start by talking a little bit about the priorities for Commissioner Carr. So in addition to some of the spectrum and infrastructure issues that we're going to focus mostly on today, my boss has also been really focused on other issues, including telehealth, closing the digital divide, free speech and big tech, and also ensuring that our U.S. networks are secure against external threats. On telehealth, for example, he has really led the way on the FCC's $100 million Connected Care pilot program, which is focused on rural and other underserved populations, including veterans. He's also worked really closely with his FCC colleagues on the COVID-19 telehealth program, and has had the chance to meet with, I think, 8, but it may be up to 9 now, healthcare providers that received funding through round 1. On network security, he's really led FCC efforts to crack down on threats posed by communist China. Most recently, he's been focused on closing what we see as a really big loophole where carriers can still use private funding to purchase equipment produced by Huawei, ZTE, and several other entities, even though they were found to pose an unacceptable national security risk and can no longer use universal service funding to purchase the very same equipment. But as I mentioned, the spectrum and infrastructure issues that are our primary focus today all play a huge role in 5G and all things 5G. And I think that's been a big priority for a long time, and I don't see that priority changing. And then one last thing that I think really jumped up to the top of the list for everybody at the FCC, in the White House, on the Hill, is closing the digital divide. After COVID-19 shifted everyone to home, our networks performed incredibly well when everybody made that shift, especially compared to networks in other countries. But it did shine a really bright light on those that don't yet have connectivity at their homes. So I expect this to continue to be a big priority, not just for our office, but probably all of the offices. And I think, we'll continue to see it as a top priority for the administration overall.
I do think one of the most interesting things just in the political landscape is the sheer amount of money available for infrastructure builds. And I think, whether it's replacing Huawei equipment or it's new builds or it's spectrum sharing technology, there does appear to be, at least in the short term, an open checkbook on a lot of these topics where we never would have thought we would have this much money available to do some of these things. It's a great opportunity in that way.
I think that's right. And, one thing for Commissioner Carr has been making sure that we're getting this funding out and that we're, making sure that we're not duplicating existing funds that are available for certain areas. So just making sure that we're using all of this funding as efficiently as possible and actually connecting the people that remain unconnected, which is why these funds are being appropriated to begin with,
And just, it's interesting because there is so much money out there. There is a lot of pressure to get it out quickly. And then the real question becomes, how do you get it out in a way that's the most effective? And we, went through this in some of the stimulus funds at the beginning of the Obama administration, is how do you put what infrastructure do you use? Is it the FCC? Is it NTIA? Is it states? I think there's some real hard questions there. And also, is it new builds in unserved areas? Is it building competitors? Is it adoption driven? What role does wireless or satellite play? I think there are a lot of hard questions out there.
A lot of hard questions, and we need to learn from history too. And what we've done is look back and see what's worked in the past, what hasn't worked. We've looked at BTOP and what happened there, and we don't want that to happen again. So just ensuring that we protect against any waste of funding or other potential issues.
Yeah, so speaking of hard questions, I do want to, looking back a little bit, call out three particular things. In Spectrum World, as I alluded to, I think I've been doing the National Spectrum Management Association Conference, I don't know, off and on for maybe 15 years, maybe longer. And it is amazing how many times the same spectrum bands appear over and over and over again in my notes. So the three I want to call out, one particularly positively, maybe one negatively, and one sort of an incomplete, but 2.5, the PI FCC finally, after, in my view, too long, gave flexibility to the band, including the full flexibility to sell and to lease, and got it moving on the tribal and open eligibility windows. And so things are really moving on 2.5. I will say, Joe alluded to my tenure at the FCC when he used to come visit me and persuade me to do whatever he wanted. And that was one of those issues where we really tried to tackle that because we felt like the band was not being used very efficiently. And it took a really long time and the commitment of multiple chairmen to get there. And kudos to the PI Commission for getting that one done and getting that spectrum from a regulatory perspective, sort of take away some of the shackles that had held it back, the transaction costs. So I was particularly excited about that one. The other I'll have a less clear grade on is the Legato matter. That's also been rolling around for about 17 years. They did reach a decision last year on a path forward. Congress promptly responded with the NDAA, which prompts the National Association of Science or National Academy of Sciences study. Congress has also been doing some oversight there. There's 8 petitions for reconsideration pending. On the eve, including one from NTIA, on the eve of the Trump administration leaving, on a partisan 3-2 vote, the commission voted against an NTIA stay request. So that's still very much a live one, but it is something that we've talked about many times over the years, and I wanted to raise. And the final is a little less talked about. It's the MVDDS spectrum. Y'all might recall, once again, many years ago, this is the North Point spectrum back in the day. So spectrum sharing with DBS and this NGSO satellites, as well as the MVDDS licensees that we auctioned off. MVDDS was has had a highly restrictive set of rules because of the complex 3-way sharing arrangement. So the FCC is looking at adding flexibility to MVDDS to see if they can facilitate 5G. So that's the incomplete. That one's still out there. But 3 long-standing spectrum bands that have been underutilized. The commission has made some real progress on. So kudos for good work there, and largely on a bipartisan basis. I know, Danielle, you've worked a lot, I think, on 6 gigahertz, if I'm remembering correctly. Any other highlights from the past year that you want to flag, or things to look forward to on the spectrum side?
Sure. So as you mentioned earlier, the PI administration really did an amazing job at making more spectrum available. At the beginning of the administration, there were a lot of concerns that the United States was going to or had fallen behind other countries in 5G. And, a lot of that argument was driven by the lack of spectrum available for 5G, including mid-band spectrum. So I just want to echo what Bryan said about the accomplishments. The last administration made 3.5 gigahertz spectrum available, 2.5, 5.9, 6 gigahertz. And so I think all told, the FCC opened more than 6 gigahertz of spectrum for licensed 5G services, in addition to thousands of megahertz of unlicensed spectrum. I think that's one of the biggest successes of the last administration, and it continues to be a really big priority for Commissioner Carr, securing American leadership in 5G. And 5G leadership cannot happen if the airwaves aren't made available in the commercial marketplace. And this has to be done very quickly, and it has to be done in a transparent way so that people know what's coming. It's really hard to execute a plan if there isn't a plan. So in this vein, Commissioner made a call.
That was a good line, Danielle. I got all of
it. Thank you. In this vein, Commissioner Carr released a spectrum calendar with particular bands prioritized not just for this year, but also for 2022 and beyond, so that we have this predictability and we have this plan. And as part of the goals for 2021, he thinks we should focus on, there are 5 bands that are part of that plan. And the first one is 3.45, as you mentioned. So making sure that we hold auction 110 and make that 100 megahertz of spectrum available in that band, as required by Congress, at power levels that will actually support 5G builds. Earlier this year, the FCC adopted a report and order establishing the rules for that band, and things are moving ahead. The second is 2.5 gigahertz, holding auction 108 and getting that 100 plus megahertz of spectrum out there. In the 6 gigahertz band, Commissioner Carr has he has called on the FCC to hopefully adopt an order this year that permits very low power devices to operate in the 6 gigahertz band, and to also allow client-to-client device communications in this band. And some of the use cases that can be enabled here include healthcare and content sharing for teachers and students, and virtual reality, and remote worker training, gaming. There are a lot of use cases. And while licensed spectrum is extremely important, unlicensed is also a really important part of the wireless economy, and the demand for Wi-Fi has been increasing. So that's 6 gigahertz. In the 3.5 gigahertz band.
Okay, before we go to 3.5, Danielle, can I talk about 6 for a second? Because I have to get a little counter in there. I just don't want to lose sight of the fact that when we got $70 or $80 billion rolling around for licensed spectrum, that there's a fair amount of demand for license too. And I do think we need to balance. I think one of the tricky things going forward is that continued balance between licensed and unlicensed. And the carriers are eager to get their hands on 345 to 355, 3145 to 3.5. I think I might have done that wrong, but you know what I mean. 3.1 to 3.45. And so I think there's still some lingering concerns about interference at 6. So at the least, want to do that. But I didn't want you to get totally scot-free with your 6 gigahertz is all set and ready to go. There's still a few things I think people are concerned about. But.
Yes, there are some issues that remain to be resolved, and we've definitely heard concerns from certain people in the proceeding about public safety concerns and interference concerns relating to public safety. So that's something that we're paying really close attention to. And there are a lot of people in the FCC that are far, far smarter than me and understand all of those issues at a very granular level. And of course, we'll be continuing to, focus on those issues. But on 3.5 gigahertz, Commissioner Carr has encouraged the FCC to seek comment on increasing the power levels for CBRS operations. We think that doing so would really help with international alignment. It's more consistent with what's been done in other countries in that band. It would also create other efficiencies for mid-band 5G builds because of the approach that we've taken in nearby spectrum. And then finally, for this year, Commissioner Carr has encouraged the FCC to initiate a proceeding to look at updating the rules that apply to the Uni 2C band, which is 5470 to 5725. Studies have shown that it's a very underutilized band, and there may be more opportunities for use of that band looking ahead.
So, I think it is. I do feel like there's so much progress being made on so many fronts. One thing that I think a lot of people were troubled by last year, particularly I suspect some of our members of our audience, is the strain that seemed to be showing in U.S. spectrum management as between federal government users and non-federal government users. And it manifested itself in 5.9, in Legato, in 24 gigahertz. Historically, there's always been some natural tension between the different stakeholders in spectrum management, in part as the spectrum becomes more congested, right? The pressure to share or to relocate or even more complicated dynamic sharing has increased some of those strains. I do think that the funding from Congress and the reforms that have been made by administrations of both political stripe have helped a lot of those issues, but during the last administration, those kind of broke wide open in terms of in the public view, especially 24, as some of the bands I mentioned, Legato being the most clear example. I can't remember a situation where NTIA sought reconsideration and a stay of an FCC order, and we had 14 government agencies saying the commission should reverse itself, and then 2 members of the cabinet voicing support for the FCC. It was a very strange regime to watch, admittedly at times entertaining. But I do think there's a lot of pressure, and we saw this in Commissioner Symington's confirmation hearing and in a few other, some spectrum reform proposals coming from the Hill, are ways that the two organizations can work better together. Over the years, there have been all kinds of proposals about ways to do that. At times, there's been talk of reallocating the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee did some work on this with options, ways of reorienting or reorganizing the spectrum function to either unify them or have another third party involved. And I guess I wanted to just weigh in and say, I think there's a lot of, and I'm curious, Danielle, if you have any early impressions of this. I think a lot of what happens can be administration specific and White House specific about the way those things roll out. And so I think that the MOU between the agencies hasn't been revisited in 17 years. I think there's a fairly strong case on a bipartisan basis that relooking at how the agencies work together to streamline it and make it more collegial, if you can, or at least more regular, is valuable. Some of the other proposals, I think, start to go further and maybe maybe dealing with the outlier case instead of dealing with the day-to-day. I mean, there's still an awful lot of successful spectrum coordination that happens between the two agencies on a day-to-day basis. And so I think we want to try and find a way to make the harder ones, a little bit less public, probably in terms of the politics of them or the politicalization of them, but B, also just sort of get the communication flow going. I mean, I think even in terms of 345 to 355, there's been concerns about what level of transparency and when bidders will have that transparency about the nature of the government operations. And I do think there's a lot of pressure about that. Yeah, any reflections on that, Danielle, early in your tenure?
No, not really yet. I agree with you that there needs to be a lot of coordination. There is a lot of coordination. As you mentioned, it can get political. I'm not sure where that will go in this current administration.
Yeah.
It is really important for the Department of Defense and the FCC together to work on some of these issues. It's been calculated that the Department of Defense holds almost 67% of mid-band spectrum, and that spectrum is really crucial for 5G. It's also really important for a lot of their missions that they have. So working together has to be number one.
And we will try and open it up. If folks do have questions, I think you can raise your hands in the chat. I think I've got that right. And I think we have the chat open. So if there are more, is there additional feedback there, let us know. Danielle, you alluded to it earlier, but obviously one of the keys for spectrum management and the ability to effectively use the spectrum, especially on the commercial side, but also for public safety, is infrastructure. And Commissioner Carr has been a real leader on this. I want to talk a little bit about the accomplishments of the Carr infrastructure initiatives. I'll call it that and throw them a bone. And also what lies ahead on some of those fronts, because I know you still have some open court cases, and obviously there are some areas where Acting Chairwoman Rosenworcel differed from what the Pai administration did. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, this was a top priority for him. It continues to be a top priority. He really led the charge and was tasked with cutting the regulatory red tape that existed there. And there were a lot of positive effects seen almost immediately. Prior to 2016, it was costing far too much and taking far too long to get the wireless infrastructure deployed. The FCC took a number of efforts. It updated its environmental and historic preservation rules. It put in guardrails for outlier fees and delays that were being imposed at the state and local level. It streamlined how utility poles would be swapped out to add new wireless equipment. And there were several other orders as well. So basically just streamline the local approval processes for the upgrades necessary to deploy 5G. As a result of these reforms, U.S. providers built 65 times more cell sites in 2019 compared to 2016. Telecom crews also deployed record highs for high-speed fiber builds. So really important impact that those reforms already had. As you mentioned, there are some court challenges that we're kind of waiting to see how it all plays out. But we're also we're also watching what's happening in localities and at the state level. We're continuing to see the orders being implemented. For our office, it's just really important that there's no backsliding, on any of these accomplishments in this current administration. Looking ahead, there are definitely some more infrastructure reforms that could move the ball forward and make siting easier. It continues to be difficult to build infrastructure on federal lands. And this has actually been really important for rural areas, as you start moving west in this country. So Commissioner Carr has expressed support for possibly designating a team within the FCC, to kind of act as a lead coordinator with other agencies to expedite the siting that can occur on federal lands. And I think we can't talk 5G, we can't talk spectrum or infrastructure without also talking about Commissioner Carr's job training initiatives. It's really, really important that there's a skilled workforce to actually build 5G. And so there are a lot of efforts underway, not just at the FCC, but in other agencies as well across the administration to address the shortage of workers that was identified several years ago. And Commissioner Carr has been engaging directly with several schools, and programs have been launched in a handful of states already. And I think, he's going to continue to make that a focus moving ahead too.
Great. We do have a question in the chat about, is there any expectation that new broadband funds will involve new broadband equipment innovation? Well, there's the Open RAN money that's being contemplated, which I think does put a heavy emphasis on new broadband equipment innovation in the US. There's also some talk that the eventual broadband money, obviously a lot depends on whether or not this ends up being a bipartisan next infusion of stimulus money, or if it ends up being a partisan vote. I believe the numbers are $65 billion from the Republicans, $100 billion from the Democrats. One presumes if it's a bipartisan bill, it ends up somewhere in between. I think I have the numbers wrong. Well, those are right. I think those are right.
That's right.
Good, I got that right. And there's so much money flying around, it's actually hard to keep track of it. $1 billion here, $1 billion there. It's not as clear how that plays out, but I do think there's there is a concern about U.S. domestic capabilities on this equipment. I do think you'll see additional funding going that way over the course of the administration. I think across government, it's true in the Trump administration. I think it's going to be at least equally true in the Biden administration that there will be an interest in fostering U.S. innovation here. ORAN is probably the lead, vehicle in terms of how people are talking about that, but it will be a broader conversation. And and Danielle and I experienced the cybersecurity concerns firsthand yesterday morning as our firewall wouldn't allow us to get in. We originally were going to be together doing our thing here in the conference room, and we were together ready to go, but cybersecurity prevented us from doing that. We're sorry about that again. Anyway, all that is to say, I do think there's a recognition of the need for a stronger supply chain component to 5G equipment and broadband, and I think you'll see that across government going forward. I don't know, Danielle, do you have any thoughts on that? We got four thumbs up though that went up through the reaction. That was good. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't see those. No additional thoughts from me. I think you got it right. We're gonna have to kind of see what Congress ultimately decides, the dollar amount. But I do think you had it right on ORAN.
Yeah. All right. Well, any thoughts on an MOU revamp? Also, given cyber issues and health issues. Oh, right. Is there a possibility of MOUs? Oh, interesting. So I have not seen a timeline on the MOUs. I do think this is another area, though, where getting leadership in place in both agencies is going to be particularly important before that can happen. So like I said, there seems to be a pretty broad recognition that it's time to update it. What it looks like is more of anyone's guess. I would commend the CISMET, the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee report discussing spectrum management in the United States and opportunities for reform, which included some discussion of how the MOU might be updated. As I alluded to earlier, Commissioner Symington also talked about this a fair amount in his confirmation testimony, and other commissioners have talked about it as well, so I'd look for that. On the second question, and if Danielle, feel free to jump in on this. I know there has long been a pretty significant level of coordination between the FDA and the FCC on these RF issues, because obviously the FCC is not the primary health regulator, and it's important to have coordination across government on that. I have not heard about a conversation per se about an MOU. I just am not aware of that at this point. But you're also the RF issues related to 5G have been an ongoing concern. In fact, I think there's also and Danielle can check me on this, there's an open court case on the infrastructure side on the OCHARD rules based on RF concerns. So those are always top of mind for folks. And the incredible team at the OET Labs continues to work on those issues. And I think just something always to watch, because it's really important that people have confidence that the equipment is safe and the deployment can proceed without any RF issues. And it's a big issue when it comes to siting, because these local communities, despite the bar and the statute, are always concerned about RF issues. And the bar in the statute, just to be clear, is that localities are not supposed to take into account RF issues as part of the siting decision, because that's a federal issue first. So I don't know, Danielle, anything more on that?
No, as you said, the FCC, continues to focus on this issue. It is an issue that is raised quite a bit, and when I was at the firm as well, it was something that we saw a lot in the FCC's dockets popping up from time to time, different studies. And, I think that the FCC will continue to focus on these issues and work with the FDA to make sure that the equipment is safe. There have been a lot of studies that have shown that the equipment is safe, and also, as Bryan mentioned, the preemption issue is one that we also continue to focus on. While local communities have raised these concerns, the FCC does have rules in place that are backed in science to make sure that communities are protected. So, but it is something that the FCC has teams of people focused on.
One thing we maybe have been remiss in not discussing enough, because I do think it's a hidden issue, and for the spectrum management experts who are perhaps listening to this, is the question of enforcement. And it is a increasingly complex issue, particularly as the sharing regimes advance, about where the locus of control for spectrum enforcement sits. Is it with the databases that are supposed to control sharing? Is it with how does the government get involved or not get involved? What is the role for spectrum enforcement, particularly vis-a-vis interference with federal users or public safety? We have, the FCC has obviously a strong enforcement team, but over the years, the field has become less prominent in terms of number of people and resources, and getting equipment and resources into the field to allow for more robust spectrum enforcement, I think, is going to be a real challenge going forward. There have been a variety of thought pieces, I guess, or proposals rolling around about how to enhance enforcement. But I think it's one that's a looming challenge as our spectrum landscape becomes increasingly complicated, especially the sharing regimes, which rely on a stronger hand in terms of geographic and spectrum sensing capabilities that are both complicated from an enforcement perspective, but also potentially vulnerable from a cyber perspective. So I think that's another one to watch. Have you seen much on the enforcement side thus far, Danielle?
No, so as you mentioned, some of it is being addressed in a proceeding by proceeding basis, depending on the regimes that are being set up. I do think that's right, that it'll continue to be a really important issue. We're starting to not run out of, but basically run out of, spectrum that hasn't been used before. So we are setting up a lot of new sharing regimes and looking at sharing and working with, other agencies to promote spectrum sharing, because it is a finite resource. And enforcement has to be a really big part of that, to make sure that the spectrum can be used in a reliable manner, especially when sometimes it's being used for life-saving, devices or equipment or public safety, which is critically important.
Yeah, it's interesting when you're grouping like with like, as we always have in spectrum management, the wireless carriers, for example, when there's interference issues between cell sites, they just work that out. And that's worked pretty well. And broadcasters have a similar, generally, easy, if you will, relationship in terms of working out interference concerns. It gets a lot more complicated when you have different kinds of users, when you have three-tiered access regimes, or you have dynamic sharing. I think those questions become much harder, and it's an area where I don't think there's much of a partisan issue. It really just calls, well, in my view at least, to have the engineers really in the front seat and the lawyers helping, not the other way around, to try to drive some of that stuff, because I do, and it's an area where I think people with expertise in spectrum management, the government's really going to be looking to the private sector to help develop regimes that make sense for everyone, that are financially achievable, but also keep our network safe and reliable. So I think it's a big challenge going forward. Okay, we have one more question. Oh, wait, the mega constellations, future space-based systems. So Danielle, can you see the chat, or should I read it out loud? Okay. Any thoughts on satellite mega constellations and the spectrum available to them and to future space-based systems? Obviously a huge issue. I know you guys are hearing about it later today. I will mostly defer to the experts on these issues. The mega constellations pose substantial questions, especially around orbital debris. I would flag that as a particular issue. Trying to figure out the proper amount of spectrum to allocate to those systems has been a long-standing commission challenge, in the sense that, whether you go back to 2 gigahertz, where I think there were originally 9 applicants, there ended up being 2, and ultimately the spectrum was converted away from satellite use because it wasn't seen to have enough demand. You have L-band, where Legato is not particularly interested in the satellite portion. I shouldn't say that was too strong. Is interested in converting their spectrum to something that has more of a terrestrial component. But then you also have these, big deep pocket new entrants with exciting new capabilities coming on the scene. And there is a need to try and balance their needs with the other. And 12 gigahertz is a perfect example of this, because obviously that slice of spectrum is slated for both potentially terrestrial, the MVDDS spectrum. DBS is an existing operator, as well as a satellite-based broadband solution. So those challenges are real and complicated, and because of the long timelines and upfront capital costs associated with those systems, it presents an additional challenge. I think the roadmap that Danielle detailed about the importance of having predictability is particularly important for those big constellations, because they do need to have something that they can count on going forward, because of the long lead times in launching. I don't know if you want to share anything more about that, Danielle.
No, I think you really nailed it. There are a lot of innovative new systems, but there is a really careful balancing act that has to be done. And predictability, as you said, is absolutely key, because of the cost and the length of time that it takes to actually prepare for and deploy these, some of these systems. So.
And although they're frustrating, I think we want to keep them as U.S. flagged constellations and keep them at home here in the United States, where that innovation is where it's most important for it to stay. So there's a balance here, right? We want to be a hospitable home, but we also want to balance the various spectrum demand. So I see Joe Sondry has joined us on the big screen.
Hey, folks, as always, very nutritious for our brains, and of course, quite a lot to talk about here. And you guys helped us navigate a lot of these big issues, large and small, and future developments as well. We're spectrum nerds here, and when the FCC created us in 1984, they did that with a purpose to make sure spectrum managers, both in government, we have a lot of government members, and in industry, and of course in other areas of policy and whatnot, are all gathered here, and we try to have these annual skull sessions to really understand what's going on, and we're just pleased as punch to have you guys here talking about this. We thought it was very helpful. I've seen a lot of comments already, and I know we'll have more. Ideally, we would have more than an annual conference. Maybe from time to time we do webinars, and maybe we'll, if you guys are willing, maybe invite you back for a standalone webinar on even a deeper dive, because there's only so much time in the day. We thank you so much for being here, Bryan. You tickled my mind. Yeah, it's well over a decade you've been coming to this, and you're one of our treasures, so we appreciate you coming and doing it as long as you're willing and able. Danielle, great to have you here. Thanks for coming to NSMA, and we look forward to future discussions. I know our next.
Joe, I just want to jump in real quick. I also want to note, I believe this is correct, Danielle, this is your first speech or your first outing as a legal advisor to Commissioner Carr?
Oh, hey!
Yeah, so there you go. She seemed like an old pro, so nobody would have expected that.
Exciting.
There you go, her inaugural journey.
Awesome. Well, congrats on that. We're pleased to have been the site for your first your first walk in the public sphere. So that's awesome.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So and we take this stuff very. We really think a lot about what's going on and the information you provide, and we do very deep dives and studies. And NSMA, because it's been asked by the FCC to do this, often provides suggested guidelines back to the Commission on Spectrum Management technical issues. We got a fleet of electrical engineers and other folks who have a varieties of really deep expertise here, and we're super pleased to just have you guys surface a lot of the meta issues and also where the prow of the ship is going. That helps us think about things. So really pleased to have you as always. And Bryan and Danielle, welcome, and look forward to further discussions. And our next item will be 6 gigahertz developments with our former president, George Kaiser. So that was something squarely presented today as well. So
I think Danielle invited you all to come in to talk to her about it. That's what it sounded like.
Yeah, well, we're gonna be right there, Danielle.
All right.
We appreciate it. Awesome. Well, thank you guys again, and I appreciate your flexibility with everything so much. Appreciate it. All right, take care, all. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.